All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We are on the lesson 5, wrapping up Daniel chapter 2. So we'll spend a little time reviewing just real quickly to kind of get it back in our heads what we've been talking about in the chapter, and then we'll spend the rest of the class talking about applications we can make from this chapter. Before we begin, Carl's going to lead us in a word of prayer.
Holy Father, we come to you tonight. Thank you for this opportunity to be shared together for you to tonight. Direct us. Help our hearts to be pleased to you, realizing that you're in control. We do not understand the situation. We know you. Thank you, Lord.
Amen. Thanks, Carl. All right, so I know several people were traveling this last weekend, and we've all had a lot going on, so let's just kind of refresh our minds with the events of this chapter. It's a chapter that most of us know pretty well, but we'll go back through it a little bit, just so we've got it all fresh in our minds. Then we're going to make some applications out of the things that we've studied, and we've talked about some of those points along the way, but we said we'd delay making applications until tonight. So let's kind of go back through. Chapter 2 begins with Nebuchadnezzar having a dream and then making a demand. What was the demand that he made of his wise men? Tell him the dream and the meaning, right? And what's their reply? Nobody can do that except the gods, right? And they're right about that. And they want him to say, they say, tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation. But he says, no, you're going to tell me the dream and the interpretation so I know the interpretation's real. And they can't do it, obviously. So what's the sentence for all the wise men? Death. Yeah. Or as Carl said Sunday. And he says, and burn their houses to the ground too. Their houses will become rubble. So there's an implication there that's their families as well. It doesn't say that, but there's an implication of that. So that apparently starts happening, and Arioch comes to kill Daniel, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what does Daniel request of him? Time to interpret the dream. But he doesn't just say, can I have time and see if I can figure it out? What does he actually, how does he word it? So that God can tell us the meaning, right? I mean, he basically says, I can give you the meaning. So he commits to giving the meaning of the dream if they'll give him time. And so then how does the revelation occur to Daniel? In a night vision. And what does he do first before that night vision happens? He goes to his 3 friends, they pray about it, God gives him the vision, and then what does he do after the vision? He praises God. He goes back and prays to God and praises God in that prayer, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit in our application tonight. Then he goes to Nebuchadnezzar. It says that Arioch rushes him in, right? Hurries him back to Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel describes the dream to him. And what is that dream? What's the description of the dream? What had Nebuchadnezzar seen in his vision? The statue. Was it just a regular old statue? Probably pretty big. And there was something different about it, right? We talked about how he was so anxious about the meaning of this dream. I mean, think about all the things he committed to. He committed to wiping out all of his counselors. It'd be like our president saying, I'm going to wipe out my entire cabinet. But not just, get rid of them and replace them. I'm going to kill them all. It's everybody that he seeks counsel from. All of his advisors are going to be killed. So he's really upset about this. And we talked about the fact that history tells us that he was in battle with Syria at that point in time. What does Daniel tell him that he was thinking about when he laid down and had this dream? The future. He was wondering what's going to happen, right? And that kind of fits along with what we see in history, that he was engaged in battle. He's wondering what's going to happen. Again, he doesn't know the outcome. He doesn't know he's going to be the world power like we do at this side of history. He's going into it. And so he's anxious about what's going to happen because he knows he could lose. And so he has this vision, and Daniel says, that's why you had this vision, and God has revealed it to you. And then he tells me about the statue. It's got a head of gold, chest of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, and then legs and feet, iron, and iron mixed with clay. So he explains the vision to him. Then what happened after that? Yeah, there was a rock that was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue where? On the feet. But then it destroyed the whole statue, right? And the whole thing turned into chaff and was blown away by the wind. And then that rock became a mountain and filled up the whole earth, right? So that was the vision that he had. And he's wondering what it means. And then Daniel goes on to tell him what it means. And what does the dream mean? We went through the history of that. That's what we did on Sunday. We just went through the entire history. Sorry, Jonathan, you missed all that. It was very well done. So who is the head of gold? Babylon and really Nebuchadnezzar both, right? He says, you are the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar representing Babylon. How do we know that it was kingdoms and not just each part of that statue was a king, subsequent king? Because he told Nebuchadnezzar, after you will come another kingdom, right? So he used that word, after you will come another kingdom, and then another kingdom after that. So we know it represents kingdoms, but he says to Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. So part of that is because Nebuchadnezzar represents Babylon. He was the greatest leader that they had, the foremost leader, but also there's an implication it's actually him. And I think we'll see as we move through the next few lessons the changes in Nebuchadnezzar and the impact Daniel's interactions had on him and what he comes to learn about God. And personally, I think that's why, part of why he was seen that way. But then who is the nation that came after them? Who's the chest of silver? Medo-Persian Empire. How do we know that? Because it doesn't tell us that. History. Yeah, I mean, that's just what you know from history from that area, right? And as a side point, again, we talked about there's other things going on elsewhere in the world. Why is this the part that we're hearing about in Daniel and really all through the Bible? Why isn't it telling us what's going on in the Far East or in Europe? Important to who? God's people. Yeah, it's all centers around Israel, right? It's all the stuff that's going on in that part of the world because it's relative to God's people, what happens to them, the Messiah, the promises of the future. So that's why this is what's talked about here, and that's the world powers from the Jewish people's standpoint and the Bible story. Okay, then the belly and thighs of bronze, who would that be then? Greece? Yeah. And then the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay? Rome. And we talked about how that fits the picture of the Roman Empire and the fragility in parts of it because of the way that they incorporated other countries. And then what would be the rock that was cut out without hands and destroyed the other nations? Christ and his kingdom, right? It's his kingdom, so it's the church.
Yeah, but it doesn't refer to it as a kingdom.
Right, but it replaces all the other ones.
Another kingdom. It's just the stone that's cut out without hands, which harkens to the New Testament. He is the stone that's
Right.
protected by building.
Yeah. So it would represent him and all of his people, and it would be his kingdom too. So it's the church, his body, and there's lots of different analogies that are used. Yeah. Verse 44. Yeah, God will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Yeah. But there's a lot. That's a whole philosophical discussion on the wording that the Bible uses because it's Christ's body, it's his kingdom, it's the church. When we look in Revelation, it's actually the people after the church, so it's the church going on into eternity. It would also include the people of the Old Testament when you look at it in Revelation. So there's a lot of what's included in that, in Christ's body. But from this standpoint, it's representing the kingdom that really surpasses all other kingdoms. And it destroys all the other ones, not because they're gone, but because it's more powerful than any of them, right? So it's just they're nothing compared to Christ and his kingdom. All right, so and then there were 4 outcomes we looked at the end of the chapter, verses 46 to 49. So in verse 46, we see Nebuchadnezzar falling down before Daniel. So the powerful, brutal world leader falls down before Daniel on his face. Why would he do that? This powerful king. Daniel has just told him what his dream was, and he knows nobody but a God could do that, right? He doesn't believe in one God, but he knows nobody but a God could do that. And so he's humbled before Daniel. And he says that in verse 47, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings. And then in verse 48, he promotes Daniel, makes him ruler over the province of Babylon. So again, not the whole kingdom, but the province of Babylon, which would have been the proper part of Babylon, not including the rest of the world that they'd conquered, and made him chief over all the wise men. And then Daniel asked Nebuchadnezzar, and he ended up putting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in high positions also. So that's the story. So let's go back now and talk about some applications, because it's all well and good to understand the story of the Bible, but really what good does it do us if it doesn't change how we think and how we act? Does it really do us any good at all? I would suggest to you it doesn't, just to have knowledge. The demons believe and tremble. A lot of people in the world understand the Bible, but if it doesn't change who we are, then it doesn't do us a lot of good. So I think anytime we study, we should look at, what do I learn from this? How can it change? Why did God tell us this? What does he want me to be? So we're going to spend tonight making some applications. So let's start with the first one, when we face difficult situations. And a comes in all kinds of varieties. We looked at a specific one for Daniel, but difficult situations come in all kinds of varieties for all of us. Let's think about Daniel for just a second, though. He's young. How old do we say he probably was? Yeah, he's coming in as a teenager, very likely, just because of what they were being trained to do and how old he was later on in the book. And this is 3 years later, so he's probably mid to late teenage years at this point in time. His hometown has been invaded. He's been taken captive and dragged away to another land. He's been facing religious opposition. Contrary to his beliefs, he stood up against that, and now all of a sudden, he's facing execution. Arioch has actually come to kill him. And just imagine if a government leader came to your door and was ready to kill you. That's what he's up against at this point in time, with all that behind him. So he's got a really difficult situation. And so question 1 points out, at this point in time, Daniel didn't even know the king's dream. None of the wise men did, let alone its interpretation. Yet he commits to God giving the answer. He tells Arioch, give me time and I'll get the answer from God. That's not his wording, but that's what he's saying with the way he words it. So I ask you to consider what he does in verses 14 to 19, and then also how he responds in verses 20 to 23. And ask you what applications can you make for today when you face difficult situations or when you face hopeless circumstances. There's a bunch of different possibilities, things we can think about and learn from that. But what are some of those applications? Glenn?
I don't, like you said, you might have been a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how, I mean, think about it, how, at what point you took a stance. And that shows us as a Christian today, as a young person, you take a stand for God.
So I'll put down take a stance for God. And I'm going to take the young person out, because really it doesn't matter what our age is, does it? It doesn't matter if we're young, doesn't matter if we're old. Taking that stance for God is what matters. Mm-hmm. Why do you say that? And so despite the fact he's facing this terrible situation, he remembers God's in control of this, right? He knows God's in control of what's happening. That's what we talked about is the theme. It's easy to say that, isn't it? But it's hard to remember when we're in a difficult situation, because our first thought is our panic about what's going to happen to us, right? You know, I start to say, I don't know about you, but I do know about you. You feel the same way I do when those things happen. We just think about what's going to happen to me. But Daniel's remembering God's in control here. So what else? Drew. Yeah, my assumption would be it was through a proxy, but we don't know. But he got that message to the king and got approval from the king. My assumption would be it was actually through Arioch, but we don't know. Yeah, so he's calm in his response. So he lets the fact. I think that's probably the fact that he remembers God's in control is what allows him to be wise and with counsel. Jenny. Yeah. So, and I put down, is that a good summary, be radically devoted. So we're just devoted to God no matter, because if we're truly, truly devoted to God, we're going to stand out even to other believers, because most people aren't that radical in their faith. Daniel really was. Remember who he was with in this group of trainees back in chapter 1. Who's he with? A bunch of other Israelites, right? How many of them actually stood up about not defiling themselves? 4 of them. And the implication is Daniel was kind of pushing the other 3. So he's alone in this group of even his own people. And I think it would go back, we talked about this with chapter 2. What does chapter 1, what does chapter 1 verse 8 tell us about what Daniel purposed? He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. And I think that was because he purposed in his heart to be a true follower of God, and be as close to God as he could. And so that's how it comes out. Excellent point. What else? Aaron?
Not only did he turn to God, but he also let him, I mean,
Yeah, that's the first thing he did was went to his three friends who were faithful, right? He didn't just go to whoever was going to give him an answer he was looking for or who was the wisest man in the country. He went to his faithful friends, right? And kind of tied to that point, what did they do together? So again, this one I don't know about you, but my first tendency whenever I face a problem is to start thinking, what are my possible solutions? Well, how could I possibly handle this? And so I start thinking through it. What his first thought was, I'm going to go to my friends who are faithful and we're going to talk to God about it. And that's what they did. And so I need to take a lesson from this. I'm sure we all do. But there's a lot of other faithful people we could go to, and that's who we ought to be turning to in their situations that we need help with, and all together going to God. Carl. Okay. Okay, I'll leave that up there just since I already wrote it. But I think I think part of the yeah. So yeah, I guess we can try to, but I don't think that should be an emphasis for us at all because God works in ways we cannot understand, right? I mean, when you see the changes that are made here through this whole book in Nebuchadnezzar and the story that's told and what God's doing for his people, none of us would have ever thought that's where God was headed with anything. And there's no way we could understand it. And I think that's true with a lot of what we look at the Bible story. Who would have ever thought that God would have brought a Savior the way that he did? Nobody could understand it. Even with the prophecies ahead of time, nobody could follow what it was until after the fact, looking back. And so I think trying to understand how God works is most of the time futile. And so we shouldn't try to, but if we truly know God's in control and we have faith in him, then just accepting how he handles things. So yeah, you can try to if you want, but most of the time we're probably going to fail at that. That's a good point also. Other applications. I've got several more here too. Yeah.
Sometimes you are the action and should be ready after that action, but sometimes it takes time. You can go back and pray about it. But he was told that in verse 15, he was told that by the Arion. He was told that, and then his response seems to be really quick right after that, and then he asked for time. So being ready to be that response.
Yeah, and we don't, I mean, if we're not going to be ready to be the person that God uses, he's going to have to use somebody else, right? So we should be ready to be the person that God's going to use for whatever the situation is. And sometimes, for Daniel, it was probably pretty easy to take the time for that because his life's on the line, right? Sometimes for us it's going to be difficult because we've got to give up things we want to do to be the answer that God uses to help somebody else or a different situation sometimes. And maybe we're not the one on the line even. But yeah, we have to be ready to be make the time and the effort to be the one that God's going to use. And what do you mean by that, Wally? He didn't have to, did he? He could have answered a different way or handled it a different way. And again, it seems obvious here because his life's on the line. But we don't always listen to God, do we? In fact, a lot of times we don't listen to God. God gives us an answer and we have something else that we want. We interpret things in a different way because it's what we want to see rather than looking objectively at what he tells us and having an open heart and mind to what God says. Let me ask you a few other things here. When their life was on the line, would it have been easy for him to just fall apart? Blame his friends, or blame God, or blame the Babylonians, throw blame. I mean, that's a tendency that we have also, right? To just start blaming everybody else and not really focus on just letting God handle our situation. So I'll leave that open-ended there. Didn't blame whoever you want to put in. A lot of times it's God that we turn to blame, or maybe our friends or somebody else. The Israelites that came before him, he could have blamed them. But rather than doing that, he just focused on letting God handle the situation through him and dealing with the current circumstances. Now, again, we don't know what emotions he was feeling. He's probably feeling a lot of these emotions. He's human, right? But what we're told is what he did and how he responded. So he had the same emotions that we would have, but he handled them in a biblical way. Jenny? Mm-hmm. And that's such a good point that we're going to talk about that with our next question, our next point. So hold that thought a little. We'll expand on that more because it's a really important thing for us to think about. So I'm glad you made that point. We'll talk about a couple other things, and we're going to jump right into that. That's excellent. So before he went to Nebuchadnezzar, he's got the answer now, right? God gives him the answer. So what's the first thing you would have done at that point? I know what the first thing I would have done is run to the king and tell him the answer, right? What does he do? He thanks God. And actually, does he really even thank God? Is that the first thing he does? Jesse, what's he do? He praises God. And I know that's a minor nuance, but my first response would have been to run to the king. Maybe my second thought would have been to thank God for saving my life. That's not really what he does, is it? He praises God for how awesome God is in controlling the world and being in control of the kings and kingdoms and raising people up and bringing them down. He praises God, and then kind of a by the way at the end, thank you for giving us this information. But he doesn't really even talk about saving his life, does he? That's not really even part of it. But he turns to God first before he handles the situation and praises God and thanks God for handling the situation that they're in and dealing with it. So I think that's an important point for us to take personally as well. What about the fact, let's go back to the fact that when Arioch came to him, I think it's interesting that he committed to getting the answer from God when he didn't know anything about what was happening. I mean, he didn't even know why they were being killed, right? So he knows nothing about it until Arioch comes to him, and yet he commits to God giving the answer. Can we learn something from that? I think that's a little tougher one to apply, but I think there's a lesson there for us. Yeah. Okay. So can I maybe say accept the answers from God? Is that kind of okay? Well, actually, no. Is there a way that we can commit to getting an answer from God? Maybe to help other people, Brianna? You want to say something else? Yeah, we can seek Him through prayer and also through His Word, right? And is it possible that we can commit to other people to helping them find an answer to things when we don't know the answer? Do other people have situations sometimes that we're around and we don't know what the right answer is, but can't we commit to helping them find it? I mean, the answers are there from God when we talk to Him in prayer and we look in His Word, so we can commit to them. I hope you find the answer from God. So I think we can do that and give God the credit up front, but also commit to God giving the answers because they're there for us. He gives us the answers that we need. Okay. We're behind where I wanted to be, but that's really good discussion, I think really helpful. So let's go to the point that Jenny made and talk about giving credit to God. So Daniel gets the answer, and after he prays, he goes to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar asks him in verse 26, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Remember who he's in front of here. The guy that's just said, "I'm killing all the wise men," and he's already started it apparently, and Arioch had come to kill Daniel. And so Nebuchadnezzar asked him this question. I can tell you what my answer would have been. What would your answer have been? Yes, I can. I've got the answer. But what does Daniel say? Kind of nutshell version of what Daniel says. Nobody but God can do that, right? So he kind of says, no, I don't, but God's got the answer. I'm going to give you the answer from God. Is kind of how he's answering that. But he gives God the credit right off the bat, even though there's an imminent threat of death. So that was the first part of question 2, how would you answer this? And I think a lot of us would have probably said, yeah, I've got the answer. We would have probably come back and given God credit. But Daniel starts out by making sure Nebuchadnezzar knows it's not coming from me. It's God's answer. And that's the second part of that question, verses 27 to 30. That's what Daniel Daniel says to him. There's a God in heaven who reveals secrets. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. And then he goes on to explain to him. And he says in verse 30 even, he makes a point in verse 30. What's the point he makes there? Yeah. It's not because I'm anything special, right? He gives God the credit. Now, from a human standpoint, is Daniel something special? Absolutely he is. It says he's been given great wisdom, and he's got the ability to understand and interpret dreams. So from a human standpoint, he is something special. But he knows where that power comes from, right? It's not because he's special himself, it's because God gave him that ability. So he's got special abilities because God gave them to him. But he makes sure he tells Nebuchadnezzar that it's not because I'm anything special, this all comes from God. So question 2 is asking us, how can you apply this today? No applications? Yeah, so that's a good general answer. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put, give God the credit when we're given praise. Is that a decent sum up of what you're saying there? Because is that an easy thing to do? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, right? Because if you just turn around and give God credit and don't say anything about yourself, it makes the other person feel kind of weird, right? Just because that's kind of how it is when we talk. I mean, we read the story with Daniel and look at that and think, man, that's a great way to handle it. I would handle everything that way, but it's not always that easy to do. But ultimately, he gives God credit first and foremost, so it's really clear. So that's, I think, one of the messages we can take is to make sure when something happens that we give that credit back to God. And there's lots of ways we can handle that, but that's something we ought to think about is why did I handle it that way? How did that come from God, and how can I word that back to other people so he's the one that's actually getting the credit for it? Because ultimately it is him, right? It's his principles, his characteristics that he's put in us or told us about that we've put into our lives that have come into play that have made us handle a situation in a good way. So it really is all credit due to him. So there's ways to turn it back to him. Yes?
There are times when a friend or family member might come to you for advice, and you might say something, well, I believe in this scripture, I think you should consider this. And I think that the person will say, really what we should say, disregard his decision. Disregard the and I think just looking at the different companies that
Yeah, and so we're kind of doing what Daniel did in question 1, right? We're giving God the credit up front and saying the answers come from God, and then we're taking them there. So it kind of takes us out of that equation, right? We're just a conduit to get people to that answer. So that's an excellent way to handle that. So when somebody has a problem, start up front with that when we're helping them. So that's different than what you were talking about with somebody's crediting us for something that we've done. Jenny?
I think there's quite a lot of opportunity again in the past to this point, not just this instance, but the praise and the standoutness that he would have had as a human, where he could have felt a sense of self-accomplishment or pride in his being. But I think it's a training on his part to understand his place and why he was the way he was. I think there's a part of us that wants to have markers in our life and say, yes, my baby's growing or I'm growing stronger, and it's like a good thing. But keeping that in balance that I really haven't been those markers that God has shown me the way and what gives them mastery. And I think it takes, I guess I say I would say, I think it takes training in our mind so that it comes out of our speech so that we can have the power to understand our place.
So, yeah, it does. You kind of had, to me, you had 2 separate points you were making there, and I thought they were both very valid points. So I'm going to put down, if this is okay, train our mind to credit God, because that's really where that begins. And Daniel kind of had to train his own mind because he wasn't in a home anymore, even with parents to help him direct that. But also appreciating our own spiritual growth, appreciate those markers along the way. But if instead of being pride, then we're going to be attributing that back to God because we've trained our mind to give him the credit for that growth, for recognizing where our growth is. Okay. So we talked about when somebody gives us credit for how we've handled a situation. Are there times where we have things that aren't necessarily a bad situation, it's just an ability we have? I mean, we've all got different abilities God's given us, and people sometimes praise us for the things we're able to do, right? So it would be the same kind of concept, wouldn't it? Instead of just what we've done, maybe it's an ability that we have. And I don't know about you, but there's a prideful side of me that tends to give myself credit for some of those things. I think I've been given a certain set of abilities, and I realize those come from God, but then we think about, well, I've done this, whether it's education or hard work or time I've put in, or I've made some really good decisions in my life, and so we tend to give ourselves credit for where we end up and where we land in those sort of situations, right? But again, the credit ought to go back to God, and so when people say something to us, turn that back to God rather than taking the credit for ourselves. And that's sometimes one that's really easy just to let it roll off your tongue and just say thank you. But we need to have in our head to give God the credit, and I think it goes back to training our mind all the time that what I am comes from God. Every ability I have comes from him. So giving him the credit in our head will lead to that happening. Any other points? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, and then training our mind to think that way, yeah. Yeah, but what we're putting into our mind is what's going to come out of it, so training our mind in the right way. Ethan?
He could have taken full advantage of the situation. There were a lot of wise men that were always put to death for that.
Mm-hmm.
Seen that as an opportunity to step up the ladder, but he decided to go about it the right way. And this is, to me, a good example of going about it the right way still has sometimes a great outcome. It always has a great outcome. Sometimes not physical blessings,
Right.
but then sometimes there are physical blessings. He still became these wise men.
Yeah.
Further than that. So he could have taken advantage, taken a shortcut, but God still put him in a position that he could have gotten.
Yeah. Sometimes that does backfire physically, though, right? But you're right. Spiritually, it always turns out the right way. But sometimes when we do the right thing, there's physical bad that comes out of it. So we have to be ready for that side of it, too. Yeah, if we purpose to do things the right way, and then it doesn't really matter because ultimately God's in control. And we're going to see in the next chapter, I know you guys know this, but with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what do they tell Nebuchadnezzar? Even if God doesn't decide to help us, we don't care. We're going to do the right thing, even if we die, right? So that's the attitude that we ought to have. It doesn't really matter what happens physically. I'm going to follow God because he's in control, and ultimately it's a spiritual battle that I'm in, not a physical one. All right, one other point I want to make out of this, if you look in 2:28, he says, who reveals secrets, talking about God. He made known, verse 29. He who reveals secrets is made known, verse 30. He says, it's not because I'm special. Daniel gives God all the credit, right, very openly. And he specifically talks about God's abilities and what God does, right? Can we talk about God's abilities to other people when we're giving credit for things? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, I have God to thank for everything, or praise God for it. But can we actually talk about God's abilities like Daniel did here? I mean, he gets pretty specific about God did these things. Here's what God did. God's done this for you. Can't we do that too? And just give him open credit before other people. We tend not to do that. I think most of us are that way anyway. Maybe you're very different, but I think most of us just don't openly give God credit for things. But we should, because every good thing that happens for other people comes from God also. Thought I saw another hand pop up. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we don't always face a threat of death, but there's a lot of times negative things that are going to happen to us, right? And it can be some very negative things, whether it's our relationships with other people, job situations, all kinds of negative things that may not be our life on the line, but there's still an important part of our life on the line. And just trusting in God to handle those, because again, God's in control of all the outcome, right? He's going to take care of us, even if it's a bad situation I have to go through. He's going to take care of us. Yes.
How long will
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he could have actually gotten for what he says here too, right? But he says what he needs to say. All right. So let's talk about leading others to see God. We've been kind of talking about that through some of this, but let's expand on that a little more. So question 3 points out that Nebuchadnezzar has power as the world ruler. And if you think about his military experience, what he's done, what he's accomplished, he's defeated Egypt, he's defeated Assyria. And he was a general. I mean, he was the general under his father, and then he became the king. So this guy is amazing. And when we look at world history and what he did with Babylon proper and what we found out about it, he was amazing in a lot of ways from a human standpoint. So this is a world-conquering general before he's a king. He's got the dominance of rule. Look at what he said back in verse 5, where he said, "I'm going to wipe out all the wise men," and it's happening. He can say something, and it's going to happen. So he's got this extreme power and extreme ability. But look at his response in verse 46 and 47. We've already talked about that a little bit. But he falls on his face before Daniel. He commands that they present an offering and incense to Daniel. And he says, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." So question A asks, what does this tell you about Nebuchadnezzar? Brianna? Yeah, so that tells us that Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have that authority, and it tells us Nebuchadnezzar kind of recognizes that a little bit, doesn't he? Even though maybe he wouldn't have worded it that way, and maybe he didn't consciously recognize it, he is recognizing that because he knows no man can do what Daniel just did, right? And he acknowledges that comes from the God of gods. Would you have thought that about Nebuchadnezzar before this happened? Do you think Daniel thought that about Nebuchadnezzar before this happened? Probably not. I mean, the day before, he was about to get killed by Nebuchadnezzar, right? I mean, somebody that's about to have you killed, and then you think they're going to bow down in front of you and praise your God? Probably didn't think that. So what else does that tell us about Nebuchadnezzar then? Drew?
The fact that he had surrounded himself with counsel to begin with shows that he was wise enough to not think that he had all the answers. So obviously he sought counsel from others and wasn't afraid to listen.
Yeah. And somebody pointed out, I don't know if it was Wally or somebody, that the attitude he had towards his counselors in the beginning of this chapter, he may have had some questions about their abilities also, maybe some things that happened that we're just not privy to. But he recognized he didn't have all the answers. And so we see a guy here that as brilliant as he is, as strong as a military leader, as brutal as he has been, there's some heart in there, isn't there? He's not just, I've got all the answers, it's my way and that's it, even though he's been it's my way or that's it. There's some openness in his heart too that we wouldn't have seen at all. So part B of that question asks, what can we learn today from seeing how he responded?
You just never know how someone's going to respond to you often. And I think that's one power between someone's heart.
Anybody? Anybody?
Anybody, if there's anybody, yeah. That has the answer about, or that's one power between hearts.
Yeah, this is the last guy that you would have tried to convert, right? That you would have thought. Now, does this mean Nebuchadnezzar is a faithful Jew at this point in time? No, he's not. There's debate about this. A lot of people disagree, but I think we'll see as we move along that he is becoming closer and closer to God and understanding who God is. Remember, he's a Gentile, he's not a Jew, but we're going to see some big changes in him over the next few chapters. But at this point, he has just recognized that Daniel's God is the God of gods. He's still polytheistic. He's still got other gods that he serves, but he recognizes Daniel's God is more powerful than any other God, which is true. So he's recognized that. He's not a faithful believer at this point, but it's opened a door, right? But this tells us that even a person that we think has absolutely no interest in God, maybe they do. Maybe they do. And Daniel took a chance of getting his head cut off, right? I've heard stories of people getting punched in the face by somebody they're talking to, and then later that person becomes a Christian. So you just never know what's going to happen. So what are some other lessons we can learn from that? Yeah. So Daniel really took himself out of the equation, right? He just said,
I think it made it easier to never
yeah.
praise.
Yeah, so he wasn't really praising Daniel, even though he was giving Daniel some credit here. Daniel took himself out of the equation. He said, God's given you the answer. You were concerned, God gave you the answer. And here's what it was. And so he took himself out of the equation and gave God all the credit in that. And so we can try to do that too. That sounds easy, but we don't always do that, I think. Sometimes we try to think, well, it's the way I word things, or how can I teach them, and instead of just saying, well, let's look at what God says and read it from his word. Talk to him about it. So taking ourselves out of the equation. And then what we were just talking about, crediting God before other people, right? That's part of that too. Giving him full credit for every aspect of it, for all the good things that have happened to them, for the answers that are given, giving him full credit all along. What else can we learn? Yes?
I think really helpful with both of those things, what's up to me is once you realize that anybody is an answer, and once you make a determination to work with God on everything you've done. So it's what we're going to be careful and kind of say, look at the piece of God's word that Daniel gave them. Hey, so and that was still, you know what? This is God's God.
Yeah.
So we don't have to worry. It's not our job to worry about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that Nebuchadnezzar didn't necessarily hear it's over for you here. There's another kingdom coming later. You're the head of gold. So I think that's probably part of what he heard here. But you're right. Daniel just kind of gave the message to him, right? He didn't try to cover it up or say, well, let's smooth this part out a little bit because he may not like that. He just gave him the message. And yeah, we worry too much about how we word things and what we say. Just show people what God said. And if they're interested in it, they'll listen. And if they're not, they won't. Is it possible we can change leaders' direction and even change government's direction by pointing them to God? I mean, look here. The world's power its direction gets changed because Daniel pointed him to God. We're going to see that happen. It can happen. Now, we may not be put in a situation like Daniel is where we have that much influence on somebody. We can talk to somebody that's got that much power, but the people that are around that have power and ability, and even if it's in a workplace or a school or a community group or whatever it is, we can change the direction of things just by pointing people to God, because you don't know where people's hearts are and who's going to be open to that. So we can change the direction of things just by pointing people to God. And again, I want to take us back to chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel had purposed not to defile himself and to talk about God. He clearly had purposed to talk about God, right? Because he's been doing that all along. And because he purposed that in his heart, a world ruler bows down to God. Through Daniel, he's bowing down in front of Daniel, but he's bowing down to Daniel's representing God. And he makes this statement about God. And we're going to see in chapter 4, he makes a much bigger statement about God that's just unbelievable. So it truly, you could change the direction of a government and even the whole world by just pointing people to God. And if we were all doing that, everybody, it's going to make some pretty big changes in the people that are open to it. All right, let's move to our last point, the theme. I want you to think for a second, do we have a political mess in our land right now? Duh, yeah, we do. I mean, there's a lot of people on all sides of things that just hate each other, and you're an idiot if you don't think like I do, and rather than having civil discussions about things. Are there social issues going on in our land? All kinds of social issues with gender issues and morality and all kinds of different things that are struggles in our land. What about a political mess in the Middle East? Yeah, I mean, look at the war that's going on there and how nasty that is. What about Russia and Ukraine? North Korea? Our world's a mess right now. Yeah, just everywhere there's a mess. So let's look at question 4. How can the theme of this chapter, the theme of this book, that God is in control, how can that help you today? I mean, Daniel's in a world, his world is a political mess right now, right? His country's been taken. He's a captive. Remember, he's a captive somewhere else. So he's in a political and social mess. We are too. So how can this theme help us just like it helped him? Yeah. It doesn't matter if there's a tyrant in charge of our country. It doesn't matter if another country comes in and takes over our country. We don't have to like that. It would be unpleasant. It would change a lot of things for us, but God's ultimately in control, and we can just rest and trust in that. And that's our second bell, but go ahead and then we'll go.
It reminds me of the scripture
Mm-hmm.
responsibility is to go beyond physical realm and remember God's
Yeah.
spiritual realm does that.
And what we need to do is just step back and do that now, right? We need to quit worrying about the things going on in the world. We can pray about them. We can realize they're problems that need God's attention and talk to Him about them, but leave them in His hands. He's in control. Make sure that we talk to Him about them and then just leave it there. And be like Daniel, not defile ourselves. That's a big part of that, yeah, because we don't want to be part of the problem. So we have to make sure that we're separate and being holy for God. All right, thanks everybody. I thought that was a great discussion, and we'll move into chapter 3 on Sunday.